Call to order a regular meeting for the Normal Town Council for June 6, 2016. Please call the roll.
Mayor Kus.
Here.
Mr. Fritzen.
Here.
Mr. Preston.
Here.
Mr. McBride.
Here.
Mrs. Lorenz. Here. Mr. McCarthy.
Here.
Ms. Gaines.
Here.
We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have had two requests to address the council tonight, and we'll do that before we move into the agenda. First person is Mike Biene. Was I even close?
You're very close.
All right. If you would state your name and address for the record.
Certainly. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Bienick, address 10700 West Higgins Road, Suite 240, Rosemont, Illinois. I'm with a company called LCC Telecom Services. We represent T-Mobile. And the reason I wanted to speak to you is regarding item L, the approval of the cell tower and the equipment at 601 South Main. My issue that I wanted to bring forward, on surface it sounds very minute, but after hearing, I hope you see otherwise. We went before the ZBA last month and were given a 3-to-1 recommendation for approval. The approval, the one dissenting vote was based on a discussion we had with landscaping on this site. And I provided you a handout, kind of a rudimentary drawing, but it kind of illustrates the point that I'm going to be making. Basically, we were asked to provide landscaping and screening for this site. And if you look at the site is tucked up against the sidewalk, and to the rear is some crushed stone in a very, very small area to landscape. So we cannot landscape the front or the rear due to the concrete. So one of the things that was discussed at the ZBA meeting was the statement that I put some statements on the handout that I provided. And it calls for, in your ordinance, screening yards by use of wall, fencing, planting, or a combination of these. And what T-Mobile has provided in the drawings, they're proposing to put up a 7-foot vinyl fence to screen their equipment. It will not be set, you cannot see the equipment from Main Street, and that was the main purpose that we were asked by staff. The staff report says screening and buffering materials shall be sufficient to ensure that the proposed special use will have no greater impact on surrounding land uses than other uses authorized as a matter of right. We believe that's the case because if you look, you can kind of see on the front picture, just to the left of the area where I drew that fence, there's a chain link fence. We're proposing a greater fence than what is there. And so that's the main issue. But here's the crux of the issue. If we are to put in ground landscaping, if you look at that second picture, again, it's pretty rudimentary, but those green symbols represent where the landscaping could be put and approximately the height that would be screened onto the fence. In other words, there's not a whole lot that would be screened by adding some plantings. And the reason that it's so significant is because T-Mobile, in order to do that, they're already leasing an 8-foot by 10-foot area to put their equipment in the fence. They would have to lease additional space from the landlord, who said he is not interested. And to do that, it would cost us, I don't know how much at this point, but at least $100 a month, which if you factor out over the length of the lease, we're talking probably upwards of about $45,000 to landscape something that really isn't going to screen anything. So that's why I'm before you requesting that we do not put in the landscaping, keep the 7-foot vinyl fence as proposed to provide the landscaping, or provide the buffering that's needed for this site.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we will delve into the omnibus agenda. Mr. Ulmer? Oh, I'm sorry, Ron. Almost forgot you. Ron Ulmer. I know, really.
Thank you for allowing me to come before you this evening. I've been a landlord in Normal for 38 years, and I've flipped one house about 10 years ago. I'm here to discuss the items under the general orders. The Panagraph headline this morning caught my eye. Homes to cost town more than expected, and that's not, since you're selling, it's not the cost, it's the net cost of the whole project or the whole purchasing and selling. And I did a little research this afternoon or earlier today, and I couldn't find a methodology or a formula of how the town does that. So I'm here to make a few suggestions. When purchasing and selling properties, to use the same kind of net present value cash flow model that a real estate or income property owner or investor would use. And this can be done even though the properties are not going to produce income in the future, but you could come up with a foregone stream of costs and revenues and da-da-da. And I think that would be a way to tell if the town's getting a fair deal or a bad deal. But I think there should be a formalized process, and I'd be willing to help with the model if anybody's interested. Number two, I heard that these are, according to the paper, nuisance properties. Well, you know, I've had some nuisance properties through the years near my apartments and elsewhere in Normal, and I became the property owner's worst nightmare, including calling the property owner at 2 o'clock in the morning when his tenants, not necessarily the manager, but the property owner, and getting them out of bed. Matter of fact, the owner of 410 South Oak, when that used to be quite a problem, called the owner of that property a couple of times at like 2 a.m. So what I'm suggesting to the town in these cases is that you completely enforce any code violations, any noise violations, and even to the point where the police or someone does call the owner of the property at 2 a.m. There is no reason to put up with these. And the couple of properties that were becoming nuisance properties in the neighborhood where I own my 5 income properties ceased. Now, in other words, I became the owner's worst nightmare. And lastly, I just have a question, whether it's buying these houses or buying historic houses, what are the town's priorities, or something for you to think about the priorities when we need infrastructure improvements, roads, sidewalks, alleys? Is purchasing old homes because they have historic value? Yes, some. How many? Purchasing like the Sprague gas station and the Bible Foundation, but at what point do the taxpayers expect, you know, at what point is the optimum number of old buildings, whether it's homes or these other properties, to restore, and at what cost? Because I think there's some other priorities in the town that are higher. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. Now we will delve into that omnibus agenda. Again, these are items that are routine and will be handled with one vote unless a council member would like to pull an item for discussion, and I'm assuming someone is going to pull item L for discussion.
I'll pull L.
Thank you. Mr. McBride, you were going to pull item L?
I'd like to be excused from voting on the WGLT bill.
Thank you. Ms. Lorenz?
May I pull item D as in dog and E as in echo?
D and E?
Yes. The two on the waiving the bidding process.
Waiving the bid process?
Yes.
Move approval. Second.
Thank you. Making notes here. Please call the roll. I'm just out of whack tonight here. Items we're considering on the omnibus agenda are approval of the minutes of the regular meeting of May 16th, 2016, and approval of Town of Normal expenditures for payment as of June 1st, 2016. A motion to approve recommended Harmon Arts Grants Awards. A resolution to accept the bid and authorize staff to enter into a contract with Carpet Weavers Incorporated for the replacement of carpeting in the third floor of the Children's Discovery Museum in the amount of $25,371. A resolution to accept bids and approve a contract with Stark Excavating Incorporated in the amount of $116,531.50, and that's for the 2016 sump pump drainage improvements project. Resolution authorizing the execution of an agreement for technical planning services with McLean County Regional Planning Commission. A resolution to increase contract with Rowe Construction for the 2016 non-MFT street resurfacing, and that's in the amount of $280,000, and that's to resurface 5 additional streets. A resolution conditionally and partially approving the final development plan for the Linden Trails planned unit development in the town of Normal at 808 South Linden, and an ordinance temporarily amending parking restrictions on Hester Street during the construction of a new apartment building at 608 East Hester. Please call the roll.
Mr. Fritzen?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mayor Coots?
Aye. The omnibus is approved with the exception of the 3 items. Item D is a resolution waiving the formal bidding process and authorizing the purchase of 5 replacement cardiac monitor defibrillators for the fire department of a cost of $143,613.05. Ms. Lorenz?
I'd move on that item.
Thank you.
Second.
Ms. Lorenz?
Yeah,
it's all yours.
my question really, and we can handle them obviously one by one, but on both of them, I just always like to make sure that we have an understanding of the reason, rationale behind waiving a bid process. I have some guesses, but I'd like to hear from you.
Well, we attempted to explain that in each of the reports, but in the case of the defibrillators, there's 2 primary manufacturers of those units, and we formed a committee to evaluate both the products for both manufacturers, and the determination by that committee was that there was one unit that was superior in terms of functionality and maintenance and those sorts of things. And that particular unit can only be purchased directly from the manufacturer. We are, however, benefiting from a joint purchase agreement, so we are getting a discount based upon actually a couple of joint purchasing organizations that the fire department is a member of. So typically, even we've asked to waive the bids, but typically under our purchasing policies, if we purchase something that's budgeted and we purchase it through a joint purchasing program, we technically don't even have to ask to waive the bids, but we did in this case in part just to make sure the council understood we are not going through a bid process because we're focused on one particular manufacturer, and we felt that was a superior device. We could go out for bids, and then it comes down to price, and don't know who would be the more competitive of the 2 in terms of price.
And is it something too where, there was other attributes like the amount, the depth and breadth of well, that's actually on the second one, but kind of some qualitative issues on this as well, as not so much quantitative on price that are considerations.
It wasn't price, it was qualitative.
Yeah.
It was what is the better of the 2 machines?
Right.
What do we think provides us with the best service and other things. So it was primarily qualitative, not at all quantitative.
Okay.
The quantitative component was considered when we were able to purchase it through a joint program. I don't know what the other company was called, Physio Control. I don't know what they're sell for, but the committee clearly felt that the Zoll units were superior.
Okay.
And that was more qualitative kinds of considerations than price.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. McCarthy?
Just one curiosity, Mr. Peterson. I assume that all bidders, even on contracts like munitions, are subject to a local purchase clause, our preference.
Yes, and these both, unfortunately, were not
Yeah.
local, but yes, that would have applied. That'd been a consideration, yes.
Thank you.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mr. Fritzen?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye, the resolution is approved. Item E is a resolution to waive the formal bid process and authorize the purchase of ammunition for the police department in the amount of $29,575, and that's from Ultramax Ammunition. Ms. Lorenz?
I will move for the approval.
Second.
Ms. Lorenz?
And I have basically no further question. I just wanted to understand the concept for both of
In
these.
this particular case, the chief is poised to come up here, but let me just say that.
Well, all right, I won't.
Go ahead, Chief.
Change him that
But my
opportunity.
we did take quotes from a number of ammunition companies. Again, different caliber ammunition, some are cheaper than others in different companies, but it was clear that Ultramax Ammunition offered across the board the lowest prices. There may have been some calibers that were a little higher. They also offered free shipping, which was a little bonus, but, so it's not as if, we did go out and look at pricing, we took informal quotes. We're just not going through a bid process, because then we may have bought 45 caliber from one company and 9 millimeter from another, and it seemed to make sense to buy all the ammunition from one company.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, and that's where we get the best competitive price, because although there may be some that are a little cheaper in one caliber, there aren't another. We look to the, as our first guide, we look to the state joint purchasing, state of Illinois, mainly state police. They do not offer all the calibers that we need. Actually, typically out of the 6 we have, I think they've got 2 or 3 of the 6 calibers on state bid, and that ammunition is different than we carry and use. And so we've had a long-standing relationship with Ultramax. It's been very beneficial for us. The quantities in which we're ordering, I mean 134 cases, 134,000 rounds typically, those are ones that, although there's a lot of, as I mentioned in the report, a lot of places that people can buy ammunition, you just can't get that quantity without being severe backlogs. And with Ultramax, our experience is even when demand has been very high and the supplies have been very low, they've always given us preference, and we've always been able to get ammunition in a very timely manner. You know, and one of the things too, we did look, because the 2 vendors out of the 4 vendors, one was Ultramax, who we've historically used. We looked at a local vendor, and even if we would have, say, gone through a formal bid process and applied I think it's the 5% that would be in that dollar range, they still, Ultramax was still the most competitive price. And the other 2 vendors were ones in which they had certain calibers that were awarded off the state bid, so we thought it was natural to go to them. Although they didn't have all the calibers on the state bid, they certainly were successful bidders, and so we went to them, and we knew that they were reputable suppliers. They couldn't match the price either.
Okay.
So that was why, in this particular case, it was the type of ammunition, but also it was most cost-effective to go with Ultramax.
Good. These are 2 very important topics, obviously, you know, life-saving and public safety, so I appreciate the conversation.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mr. Fritzen?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The resolution is approved. And item L is an ordinance approving an amended special use permit for the addition of a cell tower equipment at 601 South Main Street. Mr. Fritzen?
Move approval. Second.
Mr. Fritzen, you want to start the conversation?
Sure. I would agree with the presenter earlier that the addition of the landscape materials would serve very little benefit. Looking at the photographs or even his sketches or whatever, the vinyl fence is going to be an improvement over what the area has looked like in the past. So my concern always with landscape requirements is they'll look great when they're first installed, but you know, how well are they going to be cared for? And in this case, you get a business use that is not you know, the type of use where you have an owner present all the time or on a regular basis. They would either have to hire somebody to come in and care for that or whatever. And my concern is that down the road, the little benefit it would have maybe at the start would even lessen rather than increase over time. So my preference would be to remove that from the ordinance.
I'm also inclined to take that path on this, but I do have a question on the, if you could step forward. The indication in the presented piece indicates that it's going to be a solid vinyl fence. It's not chain link fence with vinyl woven through.
Yeah, and when we had originally started the proposal, we started with the chain link fence, and then we proposed to go to the vinyl to accomplish the screening. So that is what we were proposing.
Great. Okay.
While you're there, how often are properties such as this inspected? How often does somebody take a look at it to say, because vinyl fence also can be subject to,
Sure.
you know,
That's kind of
trouble.
what happens on a typical cell site is each carrier, their technician will visit the site approximately once a month. They will go in and tweak their equipment as needed, if any is needed, and they are typically responsible for checking their area. So T-Mobile would visit approximately once a month to check the fence and so forth and so on. But obviously, if there was any issues with graffiti or something like that, the city or the town would let us know and we would take care of it.
thank you.
Ms. Lorenz?
And this may be more of a question for staff, but I did note in the zoning board minutes that there was quite a bit of discussion around the landscaping, and I suspect for good reason it was put in there for the original. So I don't know if Mercy or somebody from the staff would want to speak on behalf of the benefits and pros and cons, perhaps, of the landscaping or not.
Well, if I may, a couple of comments. The applicant submitted this diagram
Yeah.
that shows a representation of landscaping, which is, in my mind, not accurate. The assumption is that maybe this is what it might look at day one, but ornamental grasses are a wonderful screening material. They're very inexpensive, they're very low maintenance, and they can grow to really a nice height. They're very attractive, and they just add a softening effect. And we typically, and Mercy, I don't want to preclude your comments, but it has generally been this council's policy to require, in addition to fencing, some sort of landscape treatment to soften even the fence. I think maybe the last council meeting or the one before that, you approved a utility building for another
Oh, yes.
technology producer, and we required, in addition to a solid building, we required, or you required, landscaping around the perimeter of that building to soften the impact. I don't know of many installations that have been approved, I don't know of any that I can think of in recent years, where in addition to providing some sort of fencing, that you haven't also required landscape treatment to soften that. This particular site, yes, it is a busy business site, but we routinely require landscaping in these kinds of areas, and frankly, it's not that hard to maintain, in my opinion. It maybe once a year, particularly with ornamental grasses, you have to cut them back. And I have some in my home, and I know they're really easy. You just got to cut them back once a year, and then they come back, and they're quite attractive and provide a nice screen. But we routinely require in business districts like this landscaping, not only around these types of installations, but on the site in general. And it does require some responsibility from the property owner to maintain, but that's, I guess, something that we as a community expect people will do. This particular site, it's been there a long time, to my knowledge, doesn't have any landscaping on it. I don't think there's anything. I don't think there's a tree. There's a little bit of grass, but this would, at least from staff's, add a little bit of a green area that provides some natural buffering. And again, to me, it's not an onerous requirement. I think it's pretty modest. But, obviously, if you're not comfortable with it, that's fine. But that, we would probably, then staff would need to rethink what we recommend on other similar, because this is a pretty standard requirement that we have, I think, uniformly required of other cell tower installations. The one there's a current installation that's kind of tucked back behind the building that's not visible, but now we're expanding that, and we are, it's more visible from the public right-of-way. We chose to be, I think, fair, not to require landscaping on the east or west sides because it is concrete and they would have to, but frankly, in some cases, I'm sure communities would require that too. The fact that the property owner is requiring that the cell tower company lease more land to install a little bit of landscaping is, to me, a very unusual. I think it beautifies the property, but, we can't control what the owner of the property is going to require, and if he wants to lease land to put in some shrubs or some ornamental grasses, I guess that's his prerogative. But I just want to say, this is a very standard application of screening with some sort of a fencing, whether it's solid, it could be a wooden fence, it could be vinyl, it could be a chain link with lattice, but we almost always require some sort of greenery to soften the impact of that screening. That's just what we've done in the past. I'll let Mercy, if there's anything else to add to that.
Well, and actually, that you kind of read my mind. That was exactly why I thought to bring this part up, because it just, from past experience, I thought that we had always pretty routinely done some sort of basic landscaping, and I am kind of surprised to hear that even with something as minimal, but still softening as it might be, would incur additional lease. And so I'm wondering if there isn't a compromise that can't be found there. So, go ahead.
I would say the bulk of the zoning board's conversation focused on the perceived unfairness that the cell company would have to lease more space to put in the landscaping. They were really sympathetic to that. They didn't, but as staff, we said that's really not our business as to how much space they're leasing and where the plants are exactly. I mean, it seems unfortunate, but we think as a matter of policy, there should be plantings there. And as a matter of code, I mean, the community design standards call for a combination of plants and fencing. I mean, you could say, well, in this case, you don't need the combination, certainly. I mean, just a year ago, this site came through with additional ground equipment on the west side of the existing enclosure, which would be like on the Zorba's side of the property, not really visible. It's already kind of a mess back there. And we just said, fine, just put up screen it in a decent way. We're not going to even ask you for plants. It is where it is. Well, then when they came in a year later with an enclosure that's on the street side of the enclosure, it just seemed like, how could we not ask for the fencing and plantings that we typically ask for? So we just thought it was pretty reasonable. And ornamental grasses can get to be really healthy and fairly big. It depends on what you pick. We talked about, how much landscaping should we ask for? Because there is some flexibility in the code. And we said, well, we're not going to have them put a tree, like an oak tree and mulch and lots of, something elaborate. We said, how about just some ornamentals? Because it's the cheapest, easiest screening material, and you see it everywhere, parking lots, and et cetera. So we did try to be reasonable. And I think the zoning board got kind of hung up on the whole fairness issue of leasing additional space.
And Mayor, may I add? And we don't have a problem with the cost of the planting or the size of the planting or anything like that. We would do that in a heartbeat. But when you talk about leasing additional ground space, because our equipment takes up that entire lease area that we are leasing, it could get significant. I mean, as I mentioned, it could get up to about $45,000, if not double that, depending on the landlord, depending on how reasonable he is. He could ask for a couple $100 to add that landscaping. So it's not about the plants themselves and/or the maintenance. When we looked at it, you can't landscape along that sidewalk because it's obviously concrete. You'd have to tear that out in order to put any kind of landscaping. The back portion is all gravel, so you can't put any landscaping there. So basically, that area that I've got shown with the plants is about all you're really going to landscape. And I
And that's all
understand-
we're requesting.
Right, but we
Yeah.
still would have to lease additional space, which is very significant. And the other carriers did not have to do that. So it's kind of, we're looking for we're going the extra mile by putting in a vinyl fence, which the others do not have.
So, just a couple of points of clarification. How long is this agreement?
It's a 30-year lease.
Okay, so you're talking about $45,000 not up front, spread out over 30 years.
Correct.
Not that it's still not, but I just want to make sure I was understanding. You're throwing
Yeah.
out numbers, I want to make sure I
Right,
understand
right.
how you're.
What I threw out to you was $100 a month.
Yeah.
And then you've got escalators throughout the contract over the terms.
Yeah, depending on the terms of the contract. I just
Correct.
want to make sure what you were.
Yeah,
when
that's
you're
where
throwing
I-
around 45,000.
That's where I
understand
came
what
up
you're-
with that number, correct.
Okay, great, because I was just trying to do a little simple math, and that was 35 to 40 years of spreading that out. Yeah, okay.
Mr. Fritzen?
If we require the landscaping, could they change the enclosure? I mean, he's saying that we're going an extra mile putting the vinyl fence in. Could they go back to a chain link fence and put landscaping there? I mean, where are we with that? I mean, if we require one thing, does that mean maybe we lose something else, is what I'm asking?
Not in my opinion, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a special use permit, and special use permits do offer some flexibility, and as the name suggests, it's special enough that we do have that flexibility. There's a higher impact, it's in a very prominent location, cell towers are incredibly visually intrusive, although very important, so we really do have the flexibility to ask for an opaque fence and plantings. So
But did we not ask for that originally? Because it sounds like that's a compromise that they offered.
Oh, no, when they came in with their submittal, they just showed the fence, the vinyl solid fence. I don't know that I ever saw a chain link.
The initial
It could,
submittal was.
it could be. There were documents kind of back and forth, and you had given me a sheet from a plan in another community that had a chain link fence, so it was a little confusing. But since I've been here, I don't think we've had a just straight up chain link fence that's on a public street. So I think of like the North Main example most recently, the cell tower near the ISU Alumni Center, where they put in the faux wood vinyl fence with arborvitae. Just the most recent
And that was in a
example.
parking lot.
Yeah.
I mean, they had to excavate, I assume, part of the.
Yeah, it's kind of an
there was some
odd area
pavement
where,
they had to
yeah.
remove.
Just a side question. The one photograph shows a dumpster sitting there without any enclosure around it.
Yes, Greg and I had that conversation. This site has been around so long that it probably was pre-dumpster enclosure. It's not clear to me if we can go back and require a dumpster enclosure on the site. I have to say that did occur to us as we took the picture. We could not push it out of the picture, but it is, I mean, that's part of the discussion too, 12 plants on this site. I get it. I mean, it's not going to turn this site into some award winner, but you take everything you can get, I think, with beautification. So duly noted on the dumpster.
Ms. Gaines?
As I'm sitting here and listening to this, I'm getting frustrated, to be quite honest. We have ordinances, and we've had them in place for a long time, and the reason there are ordinances are to help our community be a place where businesses might want to come and do business here because they know that people want to live here because it's a place that cares. It's a place that takes care of itself. And we put these ordinances in place for specific reasons and after many, many, many discussions. And we continue, I guess, I don't want to say we always do, but it seems like we're constantly waving this and waving that and waving this and waving that. You go up into the suburbs and they're not waving everything. They're not saying, oh, please, please come, we'll do whatever you need. They're not doing it. Why are we? Why do we not deserve some of the best? Years ago, I remember somebody saying, well, we're not a Cadillac community, we're a Chevy community. Well, why? What does that mean about our worthiness and what we're feeling about ourselves? And so I'm just like, okay, if we have an ordinance and anybody who's coming to do business here, and you look where you're coming to do business, you and I don't mean you, but I mean, businesses should know what those ordinances are when they come here. And they should not necessarily come here to let's make a deal. Let's come here to do what's good for the community, not just what's good for the business. Now, we want what's good for the business, no questions asked. But part of what's good for the business is what's good for the community. And so I think we have to stop and think about that. Or else we might as well throw out our ordinances and just let whoever put whatever. I've been to West Virginia. I've seen what some of those places look like. I don't want to live
May I point
there.
out one thing? We are meeting the ordinance. The citation that I have at the top, it does call for use of walls, fencing, planting, or a combination of these. And so the vinyl fence is meeting that ordinance. We are not trying to circumnavigate any part of the ordinance. So I just wanted to point that out.
Point of clarity from Mr. Day.
Yeah, just to make sure we're talking about the same thing on the ordinances, there are actually two separate concepts that we're talking about when we come to the ordinances. Under our cell tower article, it's both the landscaping and the screening provisions, requirements from the community design standards that apply. Landscaping and screening are two separate things under our community design standards for two separate purposes. So it's not just landscaping solely for the purpose of screening, there's landscaping for other purposes as well. So it's two separate things we're talking about, not just the screening issue under our ordinances.
Thank you. Mr. McBride.
Well, I hope this hasn't been a rude welcome to our community for you. We're
I'm sorry.
quite glad to have you, and thank you for spending a little quality time with us this evening.
No, I enjoy a discussion.
I also have to say, and I think my colleague Ms. Lorenz was alluding to this, as many of you know, we spent many years together on Planning Commission, and we were pretty vigilant about sticking with landscaping whenever possible, and I would be very much in favor of leaving it in place here. I think we as a group are always very proud of that. It was one of the small things that we are able to do as a community that makes a small difference, but it is a difference. And we want you to succeed. I understand $100 a month, but I also weigh that. I have 5 smartphones in my family, so I can tell you my monthly bill is well over $100 a month. Well over $100 a month. So this does not strike me as an unnecessary encumbrance.
Thank you. Mr. Day, before we go forward here, I've been reading through the ordinance here, and I just want everybody to be clear what a yes vote and a no vote would
Can I
trigger.
make one more comment?
Yes.
Please.
Let me get that clarification, and I'm not going to call the vote right away. A yes vote does what, and a no vote does what?
A yes vote approves the plan as passed by the zoning board of approval. It would include
Thank you. A no vote
the
would...
special use with the landscaping requirements in it as it came out of the zoning board of approval.
So would it require an amendment to...
If you were to remove the landscaping requirements, we'd need an amendment to remove section 4.
Okay. Mr. Fritzen.
I'm not going to offer an amendment. We'll let it ride as it's written. However, my point about upkeep, I'll cling to that until I'm done here. And I would take issue with the fact that we waive a lot of things. I don't think we've waived a lot of things over the years. But Foul Shots wanted an outdoor seating area. Of course, they're dead and gone. And the area looks better as a parking lot. But they want an outdoor seating area, and we require that they screen it. And those plants never looked attractive. Those plants were awful within the first planting season. So if we're going to require it, then we need to also require it be cared for. And so, plant grass there, plant whatever there, but somebody better be diligent about making sure it looks good, because I don't, to me, ugly landscaping is worse than no landscaping.
Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Mrs. Lorenz.
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy.
Aye.
Haynes.
Aye.
Mr. Fritzen.
No.
Mr. Preston.
Aye.
Mr. McBride.
Aye.
Mayor Kus.
No. The ordinance is approved, and that concludes our business on the omnibus agenda.
Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
consideration and time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Let me find my agenda here. We have two items of general orders. The first is an ordinance authorizing the sale of town property located at 513 North School to Isaac Graff for the sum of $70,000. Motion for approval.
Move approval.
Second.
Is there discussion on this item? Mr. Preston?
Question for staff. In late April, when we reduced the asking price of this property, it also suggests that we simplify the remodeling conditions. Nowhere in our packet did I see what the simplifications were, what we left out that was part of the original requirements, and then as of April was not. Can I get a little clarification on that?
Good question, Mr.
Clarify
President. Entering into the original contract, we had identified several building components, both on the inside and outside of the buildings. So, for example, at 513, there's the large exterior stairway that served a couple of dwelling units upstairs. There were some modifications on the inside of the building that needed to take place to create a single homestead on the inside as opposed to compartments. But also, as a course of action, we had the entire department run through and look at the mechanical systems and made a list of suggested or required improvements. And so basically, we broke it down to building, and I refer to as MEPs, mechanical, electric, and plumbing. Entering into this, as the realtors were, entertaining offers, some of the questions arose, well, how extensive could that be and that kind of thing. So based on some of that feedback, we stuck to our guns on the building requirements, primarily for aesthetics and to reestablish these homes as single-family homes from a footprint on the inside. And we left the others, we identified what we found to be, I wouldn't say like life safety, dangerous things, but, elements of the building that are, they weren't necessarily maintained in the best condition the past 10 or 15 years, and so some suggested and recommended improvements. And so we simply softened that language. We stuck and said, these are the required conditions that have to be met from the building perspective. And then we said, we listed the others as recommended improvements.
As a follow-up clarifying question, we have 7 here, specific conditions for 513 North School. That were the original requirements. Would you be able to help me if I
Sure.
run through these 7,
Yes.
if they're still part of the required? Removal of exterior staircase,
Yes.
replacement of exterior second floor door with windows to match adjacent windows, front porch railing and spindles.
Yes.
Let's see, replacement of front door and front-facing door with historically appropriate. Okay. At least one upstairs kitchen removed.
Correct.
All interior doors and walls on both floors that divide structure into apartments.
Correct.
And removal or repair of rear enclosed porch.
Correct.
Those are all still required.
Those are the 7, and again, principally building related.
Okay.
Mr. McCarthy? And then Ms. Lorenz?
Thank you. I don't know if this is for staff or Mr. Peterson, but I've had a couple of questions from normal residents. Unfortunately, our friends in the media have chosen to lead with how much we're losing on what we're doing here rather than any community redeeming value for what we're doing. And so I've been getting questions of why would we intentionally buy stuff to lose money with. Again, for the public, we're not a speculative real estate operation. We don't buy real estate to try to make money off of it. We generally do it for community positive things. So I think, unfortunately, we're trying to overcome some of those things. But a couple of really great questions that I got was, one, we list these as nuisance properties, and that seems to not get explained very well, that people understand what that means, what the real actual cost to the community is, to the neighborhood, to the property values. Can you speak to that a little bit? Help us understand that.
When we brought this to council back in January, I believe that, the concept of actually authorizing the manager to consider purchase of these properties. That's based with some history. We don't, as you mentioned, we don't just buy property. Trust me, I want to get out of the landlord business. But these properties with this, and again, I'll be careful, with the previous owner was a small out-of-town landlord who had bought into the community, and these weren't the greatest homes to begin with when they acquired them. And as most of you know, that they were non-conforming. They were legal non-conforming properties, essentially over-occupied, and clearly, targeted toward the ISU student population. So, but when we make the reference to nuisance properties, it's a heavy involvement in our annual inspection process simply from the building code department, where we have our annual housing inspection program. Pretty chronically, for the past 6 or 7 years, these properties were in a condition where they'd have to be posted at the end of the school year, and essentially that owner would have to spend the summer twisting their arm to try and get these things ready to be occupied again in August. And that was a perpetual problem. That's just the building code end. Certainly the police department had a, kind of a stepped up role, and that's a little different for our department. We're Monday through Friday, 7 to 5. But essentially Friday, Saturday, and sometimes Sunday nights, these were problem properties for, the adjoining property owners in the neighborhood. And so there was, a fair amount of police interaction, whether it was noise. Certainly we respond to exterior yard conditions on a daily basis during the week. And certainly on Monday morning, it was a general standing requirement that you would get by North School Street to make sure that these properties were attended to. So based on, when we say nuisance, we don't like to be anybody's worst nightmare.
Right.
But honestly, I think this landlord, either misgauged the community as far as what the expectations were going to be. I know Mercy struggled a little bit too, because some of the requirements to make repairs on the exterior proved to be a little more, another layer, because they're in a historic district. It wasn't just simply running to Menards and getting some vinyl siding and putting it over something that, damage or whatever. So I think, quite honestly, that the landlord or the previous ownership got a little frustrated and said, this probably isn't the market for us. And again, I wouldn't want to quantify it by saying we were their worst nightmare, but I think they maybe didn't see that this was the right community for them to operate in. So I don't know if that answers your question. Was a lot of just exterior property maintenance issues, and then also a fair amount of police involvement on a pretty routine basis.
So let me just add to that, if I may. It did require a lot of resources of the town on a daily basis to deal with this, and we dealt with it. I heard some talk in the meeting, well, why didn't you just enforce the laws? We did, but it's a constant, the property owner would make repairs if necessary, marginal repairs, enough to get by, but then 2-3 months later, we're back in the same situation. The police department had these on a zero tolerance, but they still required frequent police visits to deal with. So we did deal with them, but they were just ongoing, constant problems. I appreciate Mr. Ulmer's suggestion that just call the property owner at 2 in the morning. Many of these are owned by corporate entities. We don't know the property owner. We have a management company, and we will call them at 2 in the morning. And sometimes they answer the phone, many times they don't, particularly the out-of-town ones don't bother to answer the phone. They probably know why we're calling. And so Mr. Ulmer's a responsible, owner, a landlord. He's very responsible, and most of ours are, but we have some that typically are attracted to these kinds of properties that aren't. And this is simply it's an economic proposition. They do make money. Mm-hmm. You can find somebody to rent these properties. They're not at the top, they're at the bottom of the market, but there are people that will rent these properties, and they are typically not your most responsible tenants. And so when these properties come on the market, they typically, those other property owners tend to be attracted to these. Hey, I can buy this property relatively cheap, I can put a little bit of money into it, and I can make a pretty good income. And they're not worried about how much time Greg and his staff spends, or Chief Bleichner and his staff, or the fire department. They don't worry about that. They just look at, and they can make money off these. So, and, it's probably worth every bit of $170,000, given the income potential. But it's a problem for the neighborhood, it's a problem for us, and And I think it was very appropriate to step in and say, we've got an opportunity to stop this now. It's going to cost us some money. We were hoping to generate a little, we were kind of hoping to hit 50%. We didn't quite hit it with this property, but we're recovering it. And the good news is it's going to be occupied by a family who's going to live there, and they're excited about it. They're going to invest in the property. They're going to spend some money. They're going to do a lot of the work themselves. I think it's a terrific story.
Thank you. And yes, you did answer my question. I brought this up because again, we're not in the speculative real estate business. That's not our motivation here, but also to help everybody understand that there is actually an economic cost to the town and the city for this, and staff time and what have you. But also, when we originally voted to purchase these property, I was approached by a woman who lived next door to one of these subject properties who was having a lot of difficulty selling her house, and the value of their property was diminished based on semester by semester tenants in a rental property right next door in a historic neighborhood, one of our oldest. And so it certainly has an economic impact for those in the neighborhood. And not too many years ago, perhaps not on these particular properties, but in the area, we've had a number of problems with large parties in these neighborhoods that are right around the university, and complaints and beer cans, and yes, you can call and complain, but gets dealt with the next day. But that doesn't help you at 3 o'clock in the morning when your yard is filled with beer cans and urine and whatever the students are doing. And I'm all for students having a good time, but in a residential neighborhood, that's hard to quantify the negative impact. So.
Ms. Lorenz and then Mr. Fritzen.
All right. I've got two questions, really. One has to do with the final price. It looks like from some of the additional materials we have in our packet, there was initially a lower price offered than the one settled on. Looks like we were quite a distance apart. You know, what was the likelihood of getting a little bit higher out of this or any other buyer? I guess if you could describe for me what that negotiation process was like. And then the second question, if you can address, is the time frame. It does look like they will be taking possession, but is this going to be something that they see stretching out over months, years? You know, because he refers to a timeline, but I don't really see a timeline. He kind of details what he's going to do, but not the time frame of it.
Okay, but back to your first question.
The negotiation, yeah.
Yes, so we, originally 513 was listed at 115,000, or 110,000, I'm sorry. And yes, we did have, in fact, quite honestly, the real estate team, as part of their package, if you will, reached out to some what I call ordinary suspects from the building community, the remodeling community, and actually brought them through. You know, there's 3 or 4, there's probably more than that, but there's 3 or 4 that they have experience with that have done this kind of work, come through an older home, look at, and that goal would be to come in, look at the home, do some remodeling, spend some money on it, and then, you know, put it back up for sale. Not going into a ton of detail, but, you know, one reason, I wouldn't say reasonable, one offer that was actually, wasn't put in writing, but verbally to us was that, well, I'll give you 50 for both. And so, of course, Mark and the mayor, you know, he said, well, we're going to hold on a little bit. So that was from the building community. And then, as you mentioned, the current buyer of 513, who, again, is a normal resident, lives in a historic district, has been a community resident for 15-plus years, has a family. They did, you know, submit a much lower offer. I think it was around $25,000. And again, but tied to, you know, part of their submittal, it's a 3 or 4 page submittal that talked about, we acknowledge that we're going to do all these conditions, the building conditions as provided for in the agreement. And then we also have some other, you know, scope of work we're going to do in the way of interior remodeling. And I know there's, Mercy has met with them and talked about the porch. They have quite a game plan to redo the front porch in addition to the other required items. And so I believe they made one other offer that was still yet a little bit light, but more in the ballpark. And then they kind of backed off a little bit on some of theirs.
We didn't counter the first offer. We
Right.
made it clear.
No,
And I think that was, you know,
Get
let's
lucky.
take a shot, see what we can get. Don't blame them. We just said, we won't even counter. That's ridiculous. The second offer was better, and we felt comfortable with the counter. and that's where we ended up.
Yeah.
You know, if we left it on the market, who knows? Could we make a little more off of it? Maybe. The Realtor felt that it was a good offer under the circumstances based on what the feedback they were getting, and we felt comfortable. And frankly, it was a little bit appealing since it was a local family who was going to live there. We thought that was kind of a bonus. So we felt, let's go ahead and see if we can work with them. It was a little less than what we had hoped for, but it's still a decent return.
Okay.
And I think in part, I know from Mercy and I's perspective in looking at that offer too, I mean, ultimately it was Mark and the mayor's to bring to you, but they had a fairly significant amount of money that they were going to reinvest in the property as well.
Yeah.
They weren't going to just, here's our offer, we'll do these minimum conditions. They've identified doing some fairly significant improvements as well. And I guess then leads me to the second part of your question is timing. A building permit is going to be required. That's our check process to make sure that these requirements are done. So generally, when we write a permit, in a situation like this, we'll identify what we think and have a discussion with them about what we think is a reasonable timeline. We don't want this to go for 4 or 5 years. I don't think the homeowner does either. They're going to live there while it's being remodeled.
Sure.
But generally, when we write a permit, first of all, it's got a maximum life to begin with, and there's opportunities for extensions, but generally speaking, it's a year.
Okay.
But we'll look at the nature and magnitude of the project and work with them and establish some sort of a timeline, so. Does that
Yeah.
get your question?
perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I spoke with the prospective buyer, and they have contractors lined up and detailed plans, and they have kids that are school age, so, and they own a house in Cedar Crest. I don't think they have any desire to just be living in their current house and fixing this one up for a few years, or living in a house that's in a state of constant remodeling. I mean, I think their contractor has big plans to do stuff and, get it done as quickly as possible. So.
Mr. Fritzen?
I look at both of these items as righting wrongs that have been around for about 50 years. And it's what needed to be done at the time to accommodate the sudden growth at Illinois State University, and student housing, made its way out into some neighborhoods and eventually led to properties like these. I know back in the 80s, it was a fairly regular thing for us to have visitors from those neighborhoods, School Street and Normal Avenue in particular, begging us to do something about the irreconcilable differences between lifestyles that existed at the edge of the student-oriented properties and the single-family homes. And so, you got to know Ed Jelks real well. You got to know the Olbricks real well. You got to know the Schroers, and you went and sat on their porches with them and had a lemonade and discussed how, what can we do about these things. And so, those are the things that, a few paragraphs in the paper or, 30 seconds on the radio don't explain that, and can't, today, in today's media. It's just not enough space is dedicated to that kind of in-depth coverage of something like this. So what on its face does look a bit ridiculous is something that's extremely important to some people, and I think the neighbor you mentioned, Mr. McCarthy, is really where those folks were coming from. We have an investment in this neighborhood, and our property values are diminished because of these activities, and what can you do to help us? And we didn't have many tools, and we got to a point where we intentionally budgeted funds in hopes that this type of property would become available. Now, that's not in the budget anymore, but we have some available funds to do this type of thing when the opportunity presented itself. And the fact that staff was attentive to the opportunity is a result of all of that strife and frustration that built up, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and still is out there. We don't see it here in front of us like we did back then, but it was a regular occurrence to have folks in here asking for help. And we may not be able to do this the next time something's available. We may not have the funds available to do this, but this was an opportunity that presented itself. We're in a position to do something about it and turn these properties over, and in doing that, it protects the investments of other people. it protects the historic district. You know, there are people who are going to be drawn to that historic district forever, you know, because it's historic. But those on the edge, you know, they fight a tough battle. So this is going to help secure that. And it's not just about the transaction that happens today. It's about what it does, you know, for the next few decades. And so I think we're blessed to be in a position to be able to do this. A lot of communities wouldn't be able to even consider it, but, you know, good management over the years has allowed us to be in a favorable position to make this happen, and I think it's an appropriate thing to do, given the history of it all and the opportunity presenting itself. So I understand that it's difficult for people to get their arms around, and, you know, they're not all going to come out on Monday night to hear an explanation of it, and, you know, not much of what we've said here is going to find its way out there, but, you know, it is what, I think it's one of those things that, as a council person, we have to consider some things that may not make sense to other people, but we've got some history, and we've got homework, and we've got good reports, and we have, you know, a staff that's attentive to things. So, you know, I think we've done the things we need to do to make a wise consideration of this. And after all, we already bought it. We already made that commitment. So, you know, we're going to sit on it for another 6 months or another year and just let it deteriorate, or are we going to, you know, take action and move, you know, sit on it and maybe make $10,000 more, you know, like, why? Let's just get it done.
You know, and I think there's something missing in the conversation here that is important to how the dynamics of this work and the economics of this work. 513 North School, I think, was licensed in a non-conforming situation. It's no longer conforming to take 8 people into that property. So that's an income-producing property. Mm-hmm. So we have taken those properties and removed that income ability, the ability for that property to produce income by making it be a single-family home. So the value of that property plummets all of a sudden. Now we've got an older house that needs a significant amount of repair and has to be converted back to single-family use. So, you know, to say what's the right price for this or not, we are the ones that devalued the property by changing the use.
Exactly.
Mr. McBride.
I also think it's worth noting what happened. I mean, if it was not for staff having their collective ears to the ground, they would not have recognized this as a chance to correct a wrong. So I think that's worth noting. I know we don't anticipate this happening too many times. There's a map out there of, what are we down to, 5 or 6 of these non-conforming properties. But I would also offer that it might be wise. I know that once upon a time there was a program, there was money actually set aside for these sorts of purposes. We don't necessarily need that because there are fewer properties, but it might make sense to put together some sort of set of criteria or some sort of system so that we can evaluate these in a much more simple and transparent fashion. Transparent's not the right word, I want to take that back, but maybe something that's a little bit more digestible in those 30-second stories or in a couple of paragraphs. So I just offer that as a suggestion.
Further discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mr. Fritzen?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye, the ordinance is approved. Item 7 is an ordinance authorizing the sale of town property located at 604 North School to David Geschwilm for the sum of $45,000.
Approval?
614.
What did you say?
604.
604.
It's actually 614.
14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agenda's wrong, the report's
Yep.
correct.
Okay,
Second.
thank you. And assuming there will not be the same level of discussion on this property, is there anyone who would like to make a comment? Please call the roll.
Oh, no, Mayor, sorry.
I'm sorry.
I do have a question or two on this one. It looks to me, based on the information we were given, that Mr. Geschwom is anticipating completing all of his renovation work within 2 to 3 years. But as part of that, I'm going to have to go back and find the specific language. It's not a guarantee that he will replace the siding or the exterior facade. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
That it?
And I don't know, does anybody else have anything while I keep pondering this?
I'm hemming and hawing over here as well.
Ms. Lorenz?
That timeframe, which has prompted my other question for the other property about timeframe, that 2 to 3 years seemed a little sketchy for me. And I don't know, this one, for all the reasons that we were just discussing, I understand the principle of this. I don't know, this one seems to cut a little deeper and stretch out a little longer and starts to wear on me a little
Yeah.
bit. So maybe a little bit of discussion around it.
In order to make this work economically, the property owner's going to do much of this himself.
Say that again?
He's going to do much himself.
Okay.
Much of it will be self-performed, and he's just being straight and said, it's going to take me time to do it. It's not something that he's going to be able to do, and he can't afford to bring in a crew of contractors. The numbers then don't make sense. I think there's a commitment and a passion for the property, but it's also the numbers have to work because he's eventually going to get this to a point where he can then sell it as a single-family home. I don't think he, at this point, has expectations to live there, but he's got experience, but he was right up front. It's going to take him some time to do it because it'll mostly be self-performed. And that's the way I think the numbers can make sense on this. So that's why I think it's going to take him, I think he's just trying to be honest, it's going to take him 2 to 3 years.
I would add, having been in that property, there is a significant amount of work that needs to be done, and he is sensitive to the historic nature of the property. Believe it, under all the vinyl and aluminum and add-ons on that house is a mid-1800s Italianate house living there, and he's aware of that and is going to be sensitive to that in the remodel, which requires even more, probably the necessity to do it hands-on, because the people that can do that kind of work and what they would charge to do that kind of work would be exorbitant.
He is in the audience as well, if you want to ask him
Okay.
any questions, so.
All right.
I guess the paragraph that softened that for me was the fact that he lives in the neighborhood, and he's done this before in the neighborhood. And so I have confidence that he'll do it. You know, at the top of page 7-2, he lives at 703 North School. He purchased 700 North School 6 years ago and resold it a couple of years later. You know, so it's not his first venture like this. And so I understand that. I thought 2 to 3 years, and the siding is, you know, a maybe, but it's not somebody who's coming in trying to flip something real quick and take shortcuts on it. So based on that history that's there.
When we went through this originally, I went through with several people that are, experts in historic homes, including the mayor and a couple commissioners, and pretty much the consensus was this will be a labor of love. This makes no sense. Like, you would not do this unless you just wanted to preserve it.
Don't talk him out of it.
Dave knows. Dave knows.
Congratulations.
Dave is the happiest guy I've ever met, and I hope this doesn't suck all the happiness out of him. But it was just immediately obvious that, it would be easy to just say, tear this down. It's really hard. It's 40 years older probably than the other two that we bought, and that makes a lot of difference. I mean, if it was built in the 1860s, it's just, it's a dinosaur.
And it's been a rooming house for a long, long
since
time.
the 40s or 50s.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's great stories behind this house. Sometime I'll put something together for you. But we had people come through at the open house who'd lived there in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. And the woman who lived there, Aunt Murdy, for decades, she was the house mother. She owned it, and these kids lived with her for decades. She paid their student loans and bailed them out of jail and bought engagement rings. It was the story's got some neat history, but it's not an easy house to fix up. And Dave's he's not just some bazillionaire who's just going to hire contractors to do everything. So he has good connections. He's got family members in the business. He lives in the neighborhood. He's used to dealing with the Historic Commission, so we were comfortable with it for all those reasons.
We did, and if it'll help or not, I don't know, but we did during the, like the evaluation process when the RFPs were being considered, the open house period, I'm sorry. There was one or two that actually took a very serious stab at a full-blown restoration and not to live there. This was the idea that we would come in and fix up the inside and do all these conditions and kind of look at the outside, and they stopped at about 250,000. And that's giving us nothing for the property, which, Mayor, we talked about from the get-go, is if our mindset was to maybe just give this to somebody to take on. So we were quite happy to get some sort of a financial offer.
Okay.
But it's a big house. I mean, it's 3,500 square feet, and it's, well over 100 years old, and it's, like I said, it's a project. So it was going to take a very unique person to come along and try and make it work, so.
Further on this item? Please call the roll.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mr. Fritson?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. The ordinance is approved. We have no new business before taking a motion for adjournment. Are there comments or concerns?
The stranger back there in the last row that stay on the job.
Dan Irvin joined us today, so is his first day on the job?
Welcome,
Not really a
Dan.
stranger,
Dan?
though.
Hope this meeting didn't scare you off.
He did tell me this is the first council meeting he's attended since back in the days that he covered this body with WIHN, was that it? Which is a long time ago. So, I don't know if it's changed much, but the room's gotten a lot nicer.
Yeah.
There's a couple people still on the couch.
Motion for adjournment.
Yeah, I move we adjourn.
So moved.
Please call the roll.
Mr. Fritson?
Aye.
Mr. Preston?
Aye.
Mr. McBride?
Aye.
Mrs. Lorenz?
Aye.
Mr. McCarthy?
Aye.
Ms. Gaines?
Aye.
Mayor Kus?
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Yes, sir.